Coming up,
how are you going to set up that potentiation? How long are you going to be in intensities that are very different from what you're finally going to compete in?
It's phasic and it's cyclical. So each fitness characteristic is building upon the next.
Not going to build a ton of muscle doing just singles. And so you're going to use more volume, more effective reps to build that base. And then you're going to work on, neuromuscular patterning through repeated reps with weights heavy enough and close enough that it's going to transfer over easily.
Our PE training is also very popular, and that's kind of a indirect way to subjectively measure what's going on internally. So as you're adding this external load or this weight on the bar, what's going on inside of the body?
Well, if we think like on an evolutionary scale or whatnot, having to survive childbirth, there's probably a survival capacity.
So you get a signal from your motor cortex, it's sent down the descending tracts of your spinal cord, and then eventually that ends up, if it's a movement command signal, in your alpha motor neuron, which innervates a certain number of muscle fibers. Today on the podcast, we have two world-class powerlifters, Garrett Blevins and Kristen Dunsmore. Now, Garrett Blevins is the founder and CEO of Evolve AI, an expert system-based coaching app that creates the best powerlifting or power building program for you based on your strengths, your weaknesses, your training history, and all manner of other inputs that actually adapts in real time to your training. And I'm also on the scientific board for this app and function as the chief scientific officer. Now, in this podcast, we do a little bit of a role reversal, and Garrett actually plays the host to Kristen and I and asks us questions regarding the interplay of volume and intensity, the long-term athlete development cycle, different types of periodization, linear versus undulating versus block periodization. We also discuss RPE-based training and the difference between trained and untrained individuals in the literature. Now, as I said, Garrett is the founder and CEO of Evolve AI. He's also a powerlifting coach and former world record holder and world competitor in powerlifting. Kristen is also a world and national competitor in powerlifting, and she is currently a PhD student in health and human performance at the University of Concordia, Chicago. Now, before we get into the conversation, I do want to let you know that this is separate from my teaching role here at Point Loma Nazarene University, although it is sponsored in part by the College of Health Sciences for the use of this camera, as well as this microphone, this office space, and a recording space at our graduate campus. Now, Point Loma has all manner of undergraduate kinesiology and graduate kinesiology programs, from applied health science to health and human performance on the undergraduate side to occupational therapy, physician assistant, sport performance, sport management, integrative wellness, and many others on the graduate side. So if you're considering a degree, undergraduate or graduate, in kinesiology or related fields, consider clicking on that link below. Now, clicking on any of those links of the sponsors or the affiliates for the show will help out the channel and the show a lot. However, before you do so, I encourage you to consider whether it will actually make you a better strength professional, a better sports scientist, or further your craft in any way. Remember that degrees and equipment do not make the true strength professional. It's more about what you're willing to invest in your athletes as far as time and energy and care goes. Yes, leveling up your education is truly important. Yes, technology does help us to access new levels of evidence-based decision-making, but at the end of the day, there's no panacea that automatically improves your performance as a coach, except for time, experience, and care for your athletes. Now, without further ado, I bring you this conversation between Garrett and Kristen and myself.
So we're here today with the science coaching extraordinaire team, Kristen Dunsmore, Dr. Jacob Goodin, and we're going to be talking a little bit about intensity. So why should we care about intensity at all? I mean, why is this important? Why are there different intensities in different programs, and what's the deal?
Yeah, so intensity is one of the training principles that we need to be aware of, because it's a variable that we can manipulate to get closer to or farther from sport-specific effort. So the actual definition of intensity is the amount of energy that you exert in order to accomplish a given task for a given amount of time.
Got it. And so when you say like sport-specific performance, or what you're training for, whether it's lifting or endurance, I mean, you're talking about going at full intensity for your 400-meter speed. And so training closer to the intensity that you're going to compete with would be more specific. Whereas, to use a lifting analogy, for powerlifting, doing sets of 10 is further away. It's going to be less intense than, when you're in your peak and you're using lower reps, but higher overall intensity.
Yeah, like sets of 10 could be analogous to the long run if you're talking about a miler or something. So if you have somebody who competes in the mile, they're running just 1 mile for their race, they still have to do some sort of voluminous training, right, as they're building up their aerobic base, as they're building up their work capacity, and that ability to handle more training stimulus. Similarly, with a powerlifter who, as part of their competition, they're squatting 1 time. That doesn't mean that they're always squatting just 1 time and at intensities that are close to that 1 RM effort. So they also need to do things like build work capacity and set the groundwork for a potentiated training effect later when they get a little bit closer to competition.
Yeah. So it seems like that potentiation is really where it starts to get muddy. How are you going to set up that potentiation? How long are you going to be in intensities that are very different from what you're finally going to compete in? What are some of the models for potentiation and acquiring, building that base or starting a cycle with training that's different or very different sometimes from what you're actually going to be competing in?
Yeah, so we have, back into we could talk about some of the literature that came out of, the Soviet training manuals and the sports scientists that they had over there before sports science was really a thing globally. But you have the block periodization models that have sort of evolved out of that, which today look like, you start with a specific phase of training. It's phasic and it's cyclical. So each fitness characteristic is building upon the next. And so if we start with the end in mind, if the end is to lift a weight maximally, for a 1 RM, then what do we have to have in order to have that max strength? Well, we have to have some sort of a basic strength. So the capacity to lift that weight 3 to 5 times. And if we want a lot of strength, then we have to have big musculature, right? If we want big muscles, we have to be able to train at high volumes.
Mm-hmm. Got it. So you're trying to stack the building blocks for a successful cycle up, and you may want to gain some abilities or some property, but you can't get that by doing the sport-specific work. You're not going to build a ton of muscle doing just singles, and so you're going to use more volume, more effective reps to build that base, and then you're going to work on neuromuscular patterning through repeated reps with weights heavy enough and close enough that it's going to transfer over easily. Now, Kristen, you're doing a little bit, or you're setting up with your dissertation to really look into this field a little bit more deeply. It seems like there's not been a ton of work to quantify exactly how stressful, a set of 10 at RPE 10 versus a single at RPE 10 actually is, so that we know how stressful things are. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're thinking and what directions you want to go with your own research?
Yeah, totally. So right now I would say that it's definitely, we're still trying to figure out. So right now I created a fatigue outline and trying to figure out, so we know that these mechanisms can, have an acute effect on fatigue. And so right now, when we discuss fatigue, we're talking like intensity and volume, which are all measurements of like an external load. Then our PE training is also very popular. And that's kind of a indirect way to subjectively measure what's going on internally. So as you're adding this external load or this weight on the bar, what's going on inside of the body. And so what we're trying to figure out is how to use these measurements, and if there's a way that we can create some sort of stress index or mathematical model that we can either accurately predict what's going on within the body, and then of course it would be a much more efficient way. So right now, a way to measure internal load would be something like velocity loss. And it's very efficient, but it's also can be expensive if you're trying to use some of those products. So using a mathematical model that could potentially predict what's going on internally could be a way to kind of provide a efficient way to determine kind of what's going on acutely.
Definitely. Yeah, that makes sense because, with RPE as a subjective rating, if you have a benchmark set or a top set, what you're really trying to do is figure out what weight should I have on the bar for the day. And for a predictive model with, what fatigue is going to be incurred from this training stimulus, if you can predict that ahead of time, you can set up a better block that's going to need less adjustment and hopefully have better outcomes. So you don't spend time, undertraining or overtraining and not getting the results that you want. And it seems like that could be applied to any block, whether it's something it's earlier in the phase potentiation or it's later, right up to a meet. That'd be very useful. But it also seems there's a lot of complications there as well with figuring out all of those interactions, even external or internal load. Have you started any of the study design yet, or are you just doing a lit review at this point? What's your tactic to start, really sinking your teeth into this topic?
So right now we've created my outline. We've kind of briefly discussed kind of design methods and how we could potentially go about it. But right now it's definitely in its infancy. But one of the cool things with the app and what we kind of discussed was one of the major limitations within sports science literature is that, it's a small sample size, and you're using 10 people. And well, that's cool, but how does that relate to, 20, 30,000, probably more lifters, right? So what we would like to do to do a more, a study within the lab, kind of, taking direct measurements. But also we have access to a larger data set by using this app of many many people who wish to join in and participate, and we can kind of take their data and compare it to our internal laboratory setting to the real world, them in a gym. So that's one of the ideas that we are kind of currently working towards.
Sure.
And that's something too that we're excited about is having that opt-in to research, so in the app, you open it up and you go to do your training. And, once we have this update, to be able to push it out to everyone and say, hey, would you like to take part in just a silent data observation gathering, which would be, de-identified, it would be anonymous, et cetera. But and in order to generate this data set of people who actually train would be really cool.
Yeah.
That doesn't really exist elsewhere.
I hope that wasn't a secret.
Yeah. No, it's not. No, it's going to be out there on the questionnaire soon. Yeah. No. We're certainly going to do that.
But just to make it clear that nobody's data is being gathered currently.
You have to give us permission. We do. Yeah. That is an important part. But to that point, what are your thoughts, both of you? I just saw it last week, somebody talking about, the problem with studies is it's not a lifter that has as much experience or as strong as me, so it doesn't apply at all. And one of the comebacks to that was something along the lines of, but then you're looking at professional bodybuilders and you're listening to their training advice and trying to mimic. That's not you either. How useful is, in your opinion, the current body of literature on intensity and stress? And how much better do you think it can be if we did have a larger sample size, tens of thousands of users that we're pulling data from, in addition to detailed laboratory settings? How much further could we actually go from where we're at now?
Well, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Just, I think especially within the last few years, the sports science literature has gotten better. For a long time, it was, this is cool, but these are recreationally trained athletes, which means they can squat their body weight or something. Also, there was a lack of women. And so now we're starting to see women who are participating, which is really cool. And so kind of doing something with a large data set, having a large data pool that's kind of, beginners, intermediate, elite. We have this wide range of demographics that we can kind of pull from and kind of determine, basically anything we want to look at.
Yeah, I would say it's still very useful because the methods are many, but the concepts are few. So no matter what the study design is, well, not no matter, as long as it's a good, solid study design, even if we determine, we find one outcome in an untrained population, that doesn't mean that they're physiologically different than a trained individual.
They're still a human being.
They're
right?
still the same
there's a little
species,
overlap
right?
there, yeah.
So, I mean, we do research on animal models to infer to humans, and of course, there's going to be a leap there where we do have to take things to human trial first, but they're still humans, right? And so we can still determine directional adaptations. We maybe not magnitude quite as much, but we can infer quite a bit. I think the biggest problem is that if you take an untrained individual and give them just about any training plan, they're going to get better. And who was I talking to the other day about this? I was talking with a coach about this. The strength coach for the Padres. We were chatting about, a lot of the research. You take a look at it, and it's, maybe it's developmental baseball athletes, and the problem with their arm care programs, the research in that, it's like, well, these guys aren't fully developed yet. And so we can't always take those findings and apply them to the major leagues. Same thing with lifters, is you could give somebody just starting out a basic sort of meat and potatoes lifting program, sets of 10, and they're going to improve on that month after month after month. You could give them 5x5, they'll improve on it. You can give them some crazy fancy accentuated eccentric training with like plyos on their off days and a lot of potentiation sets. They're still just going to improve. They're still going to make very similar improvements to the other training groups. And the reason is because everybody starts with a certain window of adaptation genetically. That genetic window is almost locked in based on the parents that you chose when you were born. and then from there, from that starting point, you have X amount of adaptation that nobody actually knows. Nobody knows that ceiling until you hit the ceiling. And you don't even know, because maybe there's some novel training stimulus you haven't tried, or some sort of small percent gain you can get by optimizing other lifestyle factors. But I think that's really that threshold is if people make the choice to move over to the untested side, we would hope to see that they're at least butting up against that ceiling first.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Not that we're encouraging people to do that.
Right.
Anyways, but I have that's a question I have for you, Kristen, and Jacob as well. I mean, for your own athletic career in endurance. Let me think here. I feel like probably I was about 80% of the way through the strength gains that I've had in my life after my first 4 or 5 years of training. Basically, after training 4 years consistently in high school and a year in college, I had pretty much, I think it was about 80 to 85% of where I am now in terms of strength. But I've been training now for another 15 years or so to get that last 20% or 15%. Has that been your experience as well, that the first 80% came in the first 3 to 5 years, and then it's been kind of this long slog through the last little bit as you're pushing further?
Definitely. I think if I can put 2.5 kilos on my bench, that's a big deal. Whereas when I had first started, I might have been putting 2.5 kilos on the bench every week or two. That'd be great if I could continue doing that, but obviously that's just not the case. So yeah, when I started, there was definitely especially when I started focusing on powerlifting training specifically, it was, my strength went up really, really fast. And then of course, over time, it kind of slowed down, which is to be expected, especially as I get closer to my genetic ceiling.
How old were you when you started?
Powerlifting specifically?
Lifting weights.
Lifting weights.
For strength.
I was 21.
Okay.
And then it took me 3 years to actually do a meet. But I was lifting in a lab. That's actually how I got into powerlifting. Was my professor was like a bodybuilder, powerlifter. And I just thought that was so cool because he was a bro with a PhD. That's the only, and I was just like, that is awesome. That is what I want to do.
PhD bros.
PhD bro.
Yeah, it's hard to say for me, Garrett, because that's why I asked Kristen your age, because when I started training for endurance, I was young. And so part of that is that long-term athlete development cycle of, when you're going through certainly pre-puberty, and then there's going to be a lot of gains after that, or as you go through puberty, and that's when you start to differentiate between the sexes. And so it's really hard to say with people who started young, if you were to look at a curve. I guess you could compare to benchmarks, right, to population benchmarks of that sport or that particular endeavor, nationally or worldwide, to see what percent you rank in as you are improving. But yeah, for me, it was interesting. In middle school, I remember, I distinctly remember in 7th grade was when we were allowed to do track and field for the first time. And so I was like, I'd done football, basketball, soccer, and I was always quick, and I would beat people in tag like all the time. I was the champion of our school at the pacer test, like essentially the beep test that everyone hates, and I for some reason loved it because if you're an endurance athlete, you have to be a little bit crazy. And so when we got to track and field, I was like, finally something I can be really good at. And I remember I was undefeated in the mile for those 2 years. And my mile time, if we're talking about progression, tapering off, I started off with like a 20 mile. And then within a couple months, it was down under 6 minutes. And then by the end of my 7th grade year, it was like right around 5:10, 5:11. 8th grade year, I got a little bit faster. And then when I got into high school as a freshman, I was like, what gives? Suddenly it's really hard to make improvements. Once I had kind of tapped out all of those easy gains within the first 3 years. But then from there, over the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years. So up to that point, I had taken a minute and a half off of my mile time. It took the next 8 years to take another minute off.
Wow. Right.
And so, of course, though, I wasn't maybe quite at the same level of competitiveness as you two as far as world rankings, etc. But I think towards the end of college, I was not at my genetic ceiling, but I was getting close to it without a dedicated push, with all the outside stressors of schoolwork and figuring out how to be an adult and all that kind of stuff.
Yep. Yeah, and I think it seems consistent. I mean, it's somewhere around there. I don't know where the heuristic is, and thinking about all the hormonal changes of puberty as you're going through and how that changes things. It brought up a question that I've had, and Kristen, I'm curious about you as an individual. We hear sometimes, people talking about, well, if you're a female lifter, you're going to be, better at repping out, your rep maxes of 8 reps, 10 reps, but you're going to taper off as you go to singles. Whereas for some of the male lifters, you can't do a set of 5 even with 80% or something like that. You're really going to struggle, but you'll have really good maxes. Your singles are going to be a lot higher. So it's just would be kind of a different RPE chart. Have you found that to be the case for yourself or with other female lifters that you've worked with where they have different intensities, or is it just very individual?
If we were to compare male and female, I would say in general, women tend to maybe be able to rep or perform more repetitions at a higher intensity compared to men in general. But obviously it's very individual. And even just for myself, if we're comparing lifts, I respond. So for example, for the deadlift, I tend to respond better to performing higher intensity on the deadlifts and for bench press. And for squats, I tend to respond better doing a lower intensity at a higher volume. And I think that's kind of accurate for a lot of people, regardless of your gender.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would say in general, maybe women tend to, but that's obviously very individualized.
And, it depends too. I would say maybe more than gender or sex, that it depends on size of lifter, absolute load that they're lifting, amount of damage that they can cause in an RPE 9 or an RPE 10 set. Because if you think about it, one of the main reasons that we have weight classes and that we have also a split between men and women in competitive sports is that more muscle means you can lift more weight, usually, right? Like that, it's a very strong correlation. It doesn't mean if you take any two individuals that it will always be true. But when we,
Usually the same person, if they go up a weight class, gets stronger.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, if we have that interperson control there. And so women just have less muscle mass, especially on the upper body, right? And they tend to be smaller, and the weight classes by and large are smaller on females. And so then in general, if you compared a male to an equivalent female, they're going to be smaller and be able to lift less weight. And so because of that reduction in absolute load, it's posited that female could lift with greater frequency, can rep out a weight to a greater degree with more reps. But then the other cool thing that I think is cooler than that is, and I can't cite the research right now, so maybe someone can post it in the comments. But I think there's quite a bit of research to show that women just have higher pain tolerance than males. Like
that's what I've heard.
If you've ever
My
heard
wife
of,
told me that a few times.
Yeah,
Stop being a baby. That's the way she's
exactly. Like if you've ever gotten sick and your wife has also gotten sick and she's like still taking care of the kids and stuff, and you're just like on the couch, like, I have a man
cold. I was
cold.
a terrible person, but it's good to know that there's a legitimate scientific reason for this.
Yeah, 100%. So you can be validated in your man cold from now on, because your wife is tougher than you. Yeah. And I think that's the main takeaway.
Well, if we think like on an evolutionary scale or whatnot, having to survive childbirth, there's probably a survival capacity that men just don't have to deal with.
Even marathon runners, a lot of female marathon runners, after having their first kid, they'll run a marathon PR. Not right after, but it's
a couple of days later.
Yeah, like 2 weeks, and they're back at it, pretty much. No, actually, my wife, after having our third kid, she turned around, and she hadn't been she is a competitive runner, and she kind of stopped training seriously when she got pregnant with our first, and then trained through the next two. But it was after having our third kid that she came back and actually made a half marathon PR and did very, very well. And you can attribute that to a lot of things, but I think anecdotally a lot of women would say that that experience of childbirth kind of like opens their pain threshold to what they can actually tolerate, and they can go there, they can go deeper, they can get a little bit closer to God in that race than the rest of us mortals.
There you go.
So that's the secret of hitting a PR.
That's the secret, guys. You got to have a baby.
That's what I have to do.
Good luck with that. Yeah. So, well, thanks for your time today to kind of dive into intensity a little bit and to share some of where, you all are thinking with the research and how that may pair up with, some of the people that are using the app and really what we can start to pull out of there to get a data set to start driving this forward.
Well, and I will say one more thing, Garrett, is that I think that what Kristen was saying, I want to call it out, is just that individual response to training. There's such a wide variation of how we respond to different intensity styles. And we know in general what research has told us about training at lower intensities, moderate intensities, and high intensities, of course. But because of that individual differentiation, right, I think that leads to the importance of having intensity styles that are tailored to the individual, right? And it kind of gets back to what we always quote from Coach Mike T, is that you have to follow the trail of athlete response. And so even though we know that low intensities for higher volumes tend to be better farther from a meet, and you get closer and closer to those high intensities and lower volumes as you get up to a meet in powerlifting, even though we know that individuals will still respond differently within a range, within a logical range. And so to be able to give people those intensity options, I think is huge. I think that's kind of the next step in this adaptive training that is individualized for each person.
For
I think
sure.
It comes down to preference too.
Really be the most important. If for anything else, you keep training, like you don't stop. Best way to get weaker, stop training, or so. And there could be other reasons like novelty. Maybe you're having fun because you're doing more novel training and it's more interesting and it's engaging, but you're getting a novel training effect, and that's just who knows what the real reason might be. But I've thought about not just fun, but belief. If you have buy-in to the system, the level of effort and just the way that you feel and I think there may be something there. Very difficult to quantify.
Yeah.
If
Well,
belief,
it's
but
it's
kind
like
of
those
the placebo effect.
Yeah.
There's belief has some sort of impact on our physiology that we don't fully understand yet.
There's actually research.
Yeah, I was gonna. You say it.
And I'll have to. I don't remember off the top.
We'll
of my
try to
head.
post it in the chat below or
When I find it. So motivation, right, or a lack thereof. So like mental fatigue or this lack of motivation that those weights might feel heavier, but there's actually something going on within the body. And so this research, and I'll have to find it, a lack of motivation can cause a reduction in like motor unit recruitment. So that's kind of.
So for those of us who don't know what motor unit recruitment or motor units are, what are we talking about here?
So a motor unit is the alpha motor neuron coming off of the spinal cord and all of the muscle fibers that it innervates. So you get a signal from your motor cortex, it's sent down the descending tracts of your spinal cord, and then eventually that ends up, if it's a movement command signal, in your alpha motor neuron, which innervates a certain number of muscle fibers. And there's some larger threshold motor units that require a lot of central nervous system drive to actually activate, and they control a lot of muscle fibers. And then there's some lower threshold ones as well, and those are more for like fine force tasks where you have to be very precise instead of have maximal force. But the more of these motor units that you activate at any given time, the more force that you're generating. So if you can be maybe highly motivated, the theory goes, and it's been empirically observed as well, that you can recruit more of these motor units in whatever task that you are completing. But then we get into like the inverted U hypothesis and those other sports psychology hypotheses where your arousal, and not that kind of arousal, but your general arousal,
Calm down in the chat, calm down.
Your motivation in the task, as it increases, your performance goes up and up and up until you get to that optimal level of arousal where you get more and more psyched, and you just get psyched out of your mind to the point that your performance actually starts to go down. It doesn't mean necessarily that your force production goes down, but maybe your skill goes out the window, or your ability to keep calm and execute. And so in sports, we see that a more complex task, that inverted U occurs a little bit earlier on the arousal scale. You can't get as hyped up. Like imagine, have in your mind the picture of a powerlifter hitting the smelling salts and like getting psyched up, people slapping him on the back to go out for a max deadlift. What if a piano maestro did that before going out to execute his piano concerto?
You mean they don't do that? I thought that's
chalking up, slapping on the chest.
Mozart back there just putting his head through the wall or something.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's
just raging and then coming out and just playing this beautiful piece.
Beethoven always seems angry when I see him in films. I don't know.
He was deaf.
In films? Is he on film?
Yeah, of the actors.
Oh, the actors.
No, I don't think they had film back
I
then.
was gonna say.
Anyways,
so all that to say that yes, motivation definitely plays a huge role.
So you're telling me that I believed I could make my third deadlift, and that's why I just like ripped my hamstring off because I fired all of the unit recruitment.
Motor unit recruitment. Garrett, it's because you were lifting with your heart that day.
I believed I could do it, and I was wrong. So disappointment. Yeah, prepare to be disappointed if you believe the wrong thing. Is that what we're telling people? That's a pretty discouraging message, Dr. Goodin.
Yeah,
but
sorry.
But probably individual. Again, probably there is that tapering and like the task I'm thinking about, the people that do get the most psyched up for lifts. I wonder that'd be an interesting little thing to look at conventional pullers versus sumo and how aroused they get before their pulls. I feel like the grip it and rip it conventional person is the most likely to just be getting slapped in the back, but let me put my foot exactly at the right angle and get my sumo all dialed in, that they don't seem to get along. Maybe they have different levels of arousal. Who knows? I think it continues that individual difference that I've heard from you two today, that it really depends. There is no one final answer. And I mean, just thinking about how I trained in high school or in college and how I train now and the way that I perceive and think, I mean, people don't even stay the same, not exactly the same. And I think it's kind of maybe like that genetic window of or the ceiling of how high they can go. There's probably a band of what people can deal with in their training about, how hyped up they can get, how often they can get that way. It seems like there are some people they train and they're always like, I don't know, Blaine Sumner comes to mind as a person who's like, he's got chalk on his face every session, just ready to go. And then there's other people, Mike T, he might like clap his hands before his third deadlift, maybe to see like a little bit of excitement. And yeah, I don't know. Is there research on yelling? Is there like actual research on yelling before lifting?
Yelling, if there's an attractive person in the gym, if you have a spotter, those can all increase performance.
Yeah, yelling, people of the opposite sex, music, general noise volume, motivation.
Interesting.
Positive versus negative feedback, those things. Yeah.
What does that mean? Well, I did have my better lifts at Convoy in my last prep versus home gym by myself alone.
With other
but
people.
I do turn up my music very loud for my top sets. Still, I've started doing that, and they seem to go better.
And it matters too how you practice as well. Because if you're suddenly in a novel environment where now your routine can't come together, the way that you practice your lead up and your warm up can't come together, and sometimes it can be in a positive way too, because if you're always training in your home gym, that's what you're used to, but then suddenly you're at a meet. I remember being at the meet with you and you were rocking out with your music and people were coming up to you and telling you good luck and you were zoned in, locked in, those things were positive. But I think if you had felt overwhelmed in that environment, you could easily then you could be farther on that other side of that inverted U.
Yeah. I think meets especially. Do you get meet nerves? I don't think I've ever asked you about that, Kristen. If you get nervous, or what do you do when you're actually competing?
When I'm actually competing,
Yeah.
I definitely get less nervous than I did my first few meets. Now it's just kind of get in the zone. Don't really talk to people. I'll put on my headphones usually. I compete I haven't really done a local meet in a while, but I think everyone really has the same mindset, and you're not having people in the back room coming up to you and try to chit chat. So you're kind of just in your zone doing your own thing. And then if you have a good handler, they just do everything for you, and all you have to do is lift it.
Yeah.
So it works out.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. I think the last 3 meets I've done, really gotten into it. Like a fun time, like having more fun. That's there's a lot of fun when you're actually getting to be there, at least for me. But it is different at a national meet, and you're having to pick. Like the worst part is when it comes down to the deadlifts, especially for me because my deadlift is not that great. But you're having to do math and like strategize, and that's where a handler to take that away so you just can do what you need to do is helpful. And I think, training and getting used to that, like going through it a few times, having a couple of meets where you practice and you get used to that. Just getting okay. Like, I don't like it when people come up and talk to me in the back and ask questions or it throws me off, but I choose and know that that's going to happen. So I choose to just accept it. It's like, if you're going to go boogie boarding and you get rolled by the wave, well, just let it flip you around a few times before you try to come up, and just roll with it and just be okay. Get comfortable with being uncomfortable a little bit and try to find what you need right before your lifts and what to do.
Well, that's good too, because you have to be robust to those interruptions, and the people who have to have that exact thing dialed in, where if they go to the right or to the left off course, suddenly it tanks. We've all seen those athletes, and of course my experience is more from track meets, seeing the athletes who are more brittle in their performance. And it was interesting, at least at the levels I was competing in and in college, a lot of the kind of superstar, especially on the distance side, athletes, there was so much, I don't want to say superstition, but there was so much routine that had to go just right in their own mental space as they approached the race, and it could all go south. Whereas, and actually for me, the best example is still my wife, who was just so locked in with her competitive drive. One conference meet in cross country, she got to the line and coach was trying to pull her off the line because she had 102-degree fever. She was sick with the flu, but she knew if she didn't race, the team would not go to nationals. And so, this is coach, to his respect, coach did the right thing and he tried to pull her from the meet. And then she got right back on the line when he wasn't looking and competed and, just absolutely crushed it and then collapsed at the finish line. But the team went to nationals. Whereas there's a lot of athletes who are mentally very brittle. And I was like this for a couple of years as well, where if the slightest thing goes wrong, you just let that take you into this sort of catastrophizing and it goes downhill. And it takes a lot to come back from that. Once you're down, it's hard to get back up. And so having the routines, but then also being able to adapt is so important. What matters. The routine isn't actually what matters, but the routine helps you feel comfortable in a new environment or helps you block out the noise of competitors and allows you to focus on task-relevant cues. That's the important thing.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's a lot there, but we've gone long. We'll have to talk about that mental preparation and, how, the intensity, not just of the lifting, the intensity of the weights, but the intensity of the person and the intensity of their mindset and what they take. It seems to me that having, as we've updated the app, low, moderate, and high intensity options, that this may actually help some people with these different training styles as they approach their training in the gym, that they're then going to take over into their meets or their tests as well. And they can start to, practice a little bit more how they're going to play when it comes to actually going in and doing those. So very interesting. And it's great to know there is some research on that. I definitely look some articles up and hopefully give some people some more information if they want to learn more. So thanks for joining us and thanks for being here. Appreciate it.
Greatness lives inside all of us. Evolve AI uses evidence-based research and innovative artificial intelligence to optimize your workouts so you can get results faster. Evolve AI. Unlock your potential.